Okay. Well, it is time for us to begin, and then some. We're going to actually get into the first chapter of John and the first chapter of the John book. I tried to make them pretty bite-sized. They're just 3 or so pages a lesson, so there's not a whole lot to digest. As a book on John, it leaves a lot to be desired. So if you're looking for a commentary on John, find a better one. It's not that. But it's mostly using John as a place to just do a topical study of Christian doctrine. And so we'll start in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And what we're listening for out of that first line of the Apostles' Creed is God, creator of heaven and earth, is the doctrine we'll begin with tonight. Let me just go ahead and read John 1 through 18. I had a friend who, when he would teach a class, if he taught Romans, the first night of class, he read the book of Romans to the class all in one sitting. I've never been brave enough to read that much at one time into a microphone, but it's not a bad practice. But I can probably handle 18 verses. So let's do John 1 through 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only begotten, as the only Son from the Father. I slipped into King James 2 there, Paul. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." This is God's word. Okay. So imagine you have been tasked with, well, you don't have to imagine it. This is actually true. You've been tasked with sharing the story of Christianity with other people. Preachers have been telling you that your whole life. Preachers don't do it either, but we tell people that they're supposed to be, sharing the gospel and the Christian faith with other people. Once upon a time, decades ago, you might do that just assuming that the other person was some kind or another of Christian, and you were just going to kind of explain the details, right? So if you knock on a random person's door, as people used to do, and say, you want a Bible study, they knew what the Bible was, they believed in God, and just a question of whether you could talk them into letting a stranger into their house to have a Bible study. It's strange to me now that we ever did that, but people did it, and it worked for some folks. They were good at it. Others of us just got doors slammed in our face and decided there was a better way to do it. But anyhow, now we're in a situation where you just can't assume that the person you're talking to really has any notion of faith in God or of the Scriptures, or if they know who God is, maybe just have a caricature, kind of a cartoon version of God in their head. So more often than we might like to admit, we have to spend some time, you're creeping up on me. We have to spend some time explaining to people what we mean by that. What is Christianity about? And if we don't, we're kind of talking past each other. We're talking about God, and they're thinking about the cartoon version or whatever they have in their head, and we never connect the dots. So where would you begin if you were tasked with, tell me what Christianity is? Well, Christian faith is not merely a set of rules. I think that's what a lot of folks think. Again, largely that aren't Christian, but a lot of folks that are Christian, that just, well, Christianity is that thing that tells me all the stuff I can't do. Right? That's one version of it. Christianity does have some rules. I won't deny that. Okay, that may be even important. But that's not what Christianity is. Okay, it'd be like saying the United States is the Constitution. Well, it has a Constitution, but it's not the same thing. Christian faith is not merely a set of rituals. Do we have some rituals? Anybody name any Christian rituals for me? Just see if you're still awake.
Sunday worship.
Sunday worship, communion, singing, things like this. Yeah. Baptism is a ritual act. You know, it's symbolic and has significance beyond the obvious. So yeah, we have rituals, but is that what Christianity is? No, not really. Christian faith is not even a chapter in a story, in a sense that, well, here's just some story I'll tell you. What we really believe about Christianity is that Christian faith is the whole story. The fancier term for this is worldview. It's the whole thing. It's how you see everything else in your life. Okay? It's the lens through which you view everything. So how do you share that with somebody? What is Christianity? Well, it's how I understand everything. Well, you got to start somewhere. How do you do that? If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they do that in different ways. So Matthew and Luke start with, well, a person was born, and we'll tell you about that. Mark, if you read Mark, you won't read about the birth of Jesus. He skips right to John the Baptist proclaiming Jesus and Jesus being baptized as an adult and then tempted, and then off he goes doing miracles. I mean, it's fast. Okay. You're 15 verses in and you got Jesus casting out demons. We're on the run. Okay. But John is fun because John thinks, you ever asked a kid to tell you a story of what happened and they start like a week ago? And no, can you skip to like an hour ago when you punched your brother? I want that part. Well, I got up, and then I brushed my teeth. Okay, that's kind of what John does. John, can you tell us about Christianity? In the beginning, and then that's where he starts. I mean, he really begins with like, well, let me give you the whole picture. Literally, all the way back. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it is not accidental that John starts with that same language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So ignore Word for a minute. We'll come back to it, I promise. But in the beginning, God, right? We're right. And if you keep reading the next verse or two, we even get a creation reference. All things were made. There's our creation word. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. I think he's just being poetic there, by the way. I don't think he's trying to say, now there were some not made things that He didn't make. I don't think he's trying to be really like analytic logic there, but I always wonder about that. Well, I think he's saying, if it is, He made it. That's kind of his point. It's just, a big way of saying, if you can name it, God made it. That's not it. So that's a creation reference in the first 3 verses. And sure enough, that's where Christian faith really has to begin. Again, we take that for granted because you grew up in the Bible Belt. You grew up in a Western civilization where this was just kind of an assumed thing. Well, God. But remember, a big chunk of the world, even today, doesn't buy into that. Just finished up in December a seminar on world religions. There are religions that don't even have a God in it, right? And that exists. Buddhism doesn't have a divine figure. Hinduism has thousands, which is more confusing. But the point is, the assumption that you meet somebody, pick a random person on the planet, and they would agree with that sentiment, in the beginning God did something, is not true now, that everyone would believe that. Certainly in the ancient world, that was a minority opinion. Okay? So in ancient philosophy, you begin with a thing. When you read ancient Greek myths or Roman mythology or ancient philosophy, they just start with, well, there's the universe, and then they start telling the story. Again, even today, if you talk to a Hindu person about the universe, they're going to say, well, there's the universe, and then they start telling you the story. Well, where'd that come from? Well, there's the universe. and that's where the story starts. You start with the universe more or less as it is, and they don't feel compelled to explain that. It was here before we got here. It'll be here after I'm gone. It's always been here. It's kind of the assumption that most ancient people would have, that a lot of modern people would have. Okay? So what Scripture does, certainly Christian faith, is that instead of beginning with a thing, right? Well, there's this world we all live in, and this is just the way it is. Christian faith begins with a person. Okay? So in the beginning, God, not a thing, a person, a being. He's not exactly a person like you. If he was, he couldn't do the things we needed him to do to tell this story. But he is a person like you're a person. You are who you are. You've only ever been you. Whatever it means to be a person, well, God is God, and he's only ever been God, and that's who he is. Okay? He's a person. He has an identity. He can communicate ideas. He can act and do things. Okay? And that's I know it sounds like we're just starting at the basement and working our way up, but really it is. That's the base level. We'll start with that. We don't think it's just here. We think there is a person. That's the first thing you have to know. Okay? Everybody starts somewhere in their view of what's going on in the world. Christians say we start with a person. We're going to call that person God. We don't have a lot of better names or terms. In languages, it gets kind of dicey, so we'll start with God for now. And that's what John does. The Word was God. What can you tell us about this God? In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay. That's also very different from the way a lot of ancient people thought, and again, the way a lot of people in the world today think. Even Christian people don't necessarily get that. This is a positive statement about God. Okay? To make that point, read it the other way. In him was death, and the death was darkness over all the earth. Right? That'd be miserable. Okay? So it's not saying that. And you say, well, who would say that? Pretty much everybody. In the ancient world, the gods were like despot, tyrant meanies, right? They picked on people. Their finger hovers over the smite button, ready to get you, when you did something they didn't like. Not even did something bad, just did something they didn't like. The whole story of the Odyssey is a story of a guy who didn't thank God, so off you go. You didn't appreciate me. I'll show you. Here's the story of a guy lost at sea and all. Okay. So that's the ancient drama. Think about life as an ancient person. Pretend you're not a modern person with all of our conveniences. Ancient life was kind of miserable. Mortality rates were very, very high. People died. They died young. Okay? Life was harsh and cruel. So what did you think about God? Probably pretty rotten. Okay? And it was the Hebrew people who had the audacity to say, no, we actually think he's good. We think we messed up. We think he's all right. And that's, again, a crazy notion that John brings forward into Christian faith. God is the source of life, not death. The God known to Christians is no despot, he's not a tyrant. He's the giver of life and the enemy of death. Right? We made the death problem. he wants to defeat death. That's many Christians believe. God is actually out to do us good. He's on our side, even when we work against ourselves. We are our own worst enemy. He is our greatest ally. Okay? That's a very fundamentally different story than the way a lot of people see the world even today. Even among some Christian folks who have a pretty grim, abusive view of God. God's on our side. You may not be on your side, but God is on your side. And that's an incredible truth being taught in the Christian faith. Problem is, when we talk about God, why doesn't just everybody believe in God? A lot of folks do. It's because God seems absent. You say, Ben, okay, you believe in God. Can you show him to me? Is he in the other room? Is he going to come in and introduce himself? How about when you worship him? Does he descend like a dove on the preacher's podium and introduce himself? I assume you have video evidence of your God doing something like a person does. And to that, all of that, of course, I'm being facetious. We say, well, it doesn't quite work like that. Kind of sheepishly. Okay. God seems sometimes to be hidden from obvious view. Okay. If God's the most important person in the story, why is his presence not as plain as day? Okay. One answer to that, there's two answers. I'll give you the first and I'll give you John's answer, which is way better probably. The first answer is, you don't usually see the author of the story. Right? When you pick up a book, I like Michael Crichton. So when I read Jurassic Park, I find out about dinosaurs and scientists. I never meet Michael Crichton. His name's on the cover, but I never actually meet him. I'm just hearing the story he tells. Okay? God is the author of the story. And so, yeah, he's not always on the page saying, oh, by the way, I'm the author. I'm in charge here. Right? You're reading the story he tells. John's answer is even better than that. There was a man sent from God. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. John 1, 6 and 7. John's answer is, actually, God does want to be known. Okay? He's not trying to be a cryptic riddle in the sky. Okay? He understood in this, you wouldn't need God to give you a hint unless John is acknowledging, I know sometimes I don't see God. Okay? But he's also saying this is a God who wants us to know who he is. Okay? Does it have to be that way? Could God have been indifferent? Made us and spun the universe up and turned us loose and said, all right, I'm done with you kids. And God actually seems to want us to know who he is, and goes as far as to send a person as a witness, that word there, witness, right? A messenger of some sort. God wants to be known. In this context, and this is the last time we'll talk about it in the whole study, the person in the context is John the Baptist, who came to say, here he comes. It was John's job. It was a good job. Came and said, here he comes, and then got out of the way. But God has done this in lots of different ways. Hebrews 1 and 2. Well, here I go again, Colin. I can only quote it in the King James. So, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spoke in times past by the prophets. I don't know what a divers manner is, but he did. Okay? So, at sundry times and many ways, God spoke in the past to the fathers by the prophets. But he has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Okay? God has always wanted to reveal himself. God has always revealed himself in various ways. But what John is going to tell us now, and this is what Christian faith is about, is there's going to be an ultimate revelation of who God is. God's going to make himself known in a way he's never done it before. Okay? So what is Christian faith about? There is a God. He wants to be known. And the Christian story is he wants to reveal himself and has revealed himself in one very special way that we want to know about. So, John 1:9, the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. Here it comes. Again, I love John because he doesn't start with, well, there was Joseph and there was Mary. He starts with this wild, sweeping language. The light of God was coming into the world, like his hair's on fire, and he's trying to explain the cosmic mystery of the universe to you, right? The light was coming into the world, and here it comes, and it's going to be wonderful. What he's trying to say, it seems, is that every other messenger from God has given us a glimpse of our Creator. Okay? Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah gets called up in some kind of vision, some kind, or I don't know. Somehow or other, he ends up in the throne room of God. And he gets to eavesdrop on God. God's having a conversation with angels, and Isaiah is just kind of listening. And so for one chapter of Isaiah, you get a glimpse of what it might be like to kind of eavesdrop on God. Okay. Every other messenger from God has given us kind of a glimpse. God's kind of like this. Okay. What makes the gospel story the very foundation of the Christian faith is that at last God has revealed himself fully to us in one person. One perfect, beautiful, everything you need to know about God revelation. That's what John is trying to tell you. Here he comes. Here he comes. Okay. And so going back then to this, that's what he was trying to introduce with this sentence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. What's that mean? I was in a Greek class at OU, which was a lot of fun because they're used to teaching secular Greek, and here's this preacher kid in the room, only interested in Bible stuff. And the professor knew it, and he was a person of faith himself. So from time to time, he'd throw me a curveball just for fun. And so he wrote this sentence on the board in Greek. The Word was God. He says, I can tell you what that says. I have no idea what it means. I mean, it's easy to translate into English. In fact, most people who study Greek start in John because it's easy Greek. See, spot, run. The Word was God. Now, what's that mean? Well, what have you heard? I want to sip my coffee. What have you heard? What does it mean when he says the Word was God? What's that word business?
If you're a beginning Bible student, it's puzzling for him to say the Word was God and then to turn around and say, well, no, he was with you.
Yeah.
So which is it?
Yeah. I'm the senior minister here, and the senior minister is right here with me. That's good English, isn't it? You say, no. You can't be there by yourself with somebody else. That's not allowed. How's that work? So that's strange right up front. And if you're asking, by the way, well, does the Greek make it clearer? No, it makes it fuzzier.
Well,
That's just what you got.
If you were a Greek reading that, you might read it this way. In the beginning was knowledge.
Okay.
And the knowledge was with God, and the knowledge was God.
Okay. So maybe word,
But
or
then
a Greek word
personified-
logos, is kind of a stand-in for knowledge and information of some kind. A Greek philosopher would like that.
But then he personifies it, that the knowledge, he personifies it in the masculine pronoun by saying, he, the knowledge, was in the beginning with God.
Yeah, so that, if you only had that first line, you could just kind of say, knowledge, God, something, vague like that and run with it. But then he treats this, as you say, this word as if he's a person. That's kind of weird. Miss Joy? That's a good answer. I like that very much.
Two things. One, I have a question and then I have a comment. One is, when it says logos for word,
Mm-hmm.
in the Greek Old Testament, is that the same word that's used for word throughout the scriptures, primarily? Like it says, when the word of the Lord came to a prophet,
I
the word of the Lord said.
think so. There's more than one Greek word for Lord, is what, or for word, is
yeah.
what she's asking. Is this the word they used for their scripture? I want to say yes, but I'd have to, making me think. I need more coffee, hang on. No, go ahead with your comment.
Okay, and the comment is, he's taking you back to Genesis. Obviously, you already commented on that. So, when you look at the word for God in Hebrew,
In Genesis?
in Genesis, it's
I say
Elohim.
Genesis 1, yeah.
Yes, it's Elohim
That's God.
throughout, which is a plural, which I know can be argued,
Yeah.
but there is a singular form that's for God too, and it is a plural option
Yeah.
there.
Yahweh.
And then it says, let us make man in our image. So the us is not ever contested that I'm aware of, not saying it's not, I'm not saying it's not. But there seems to be the introduction of a plurality in creation itself. And I wonder, is John connecting that there, emphasizing
Yeah.
Jesus was creator? I mean, that direct connection with
I'll say,
the language.
as a Christian who goes back and then rereads Genesis, you say, ooh, maybe, right? Reading Genesis, you would never have come to that conclusion by yourself, right? In fact, Hebrew thought, just devoutly, there is one God. I know it says plural, there's one, and one, and one, and the rest are pagans. I mean, it's really emphatic, but you wouldn't have read Genesis and said, well, but there are multiple gods in Genesis 1. You'd still say, there's
It's still
one
singular.
being. Yeah.
I mean, that,
Referred to plural. What my Hebrew professor who went to Hebrew Union School and learned from the rabbis, I guess, about Hebrew, he said the way they explained it was like when the queen says, we are not amused. It's the plural of majesty, of we in a big sense. I'm such a big person, I take more than one person. I represent more than myself. Again, as you say, it's contested. So as a Christian reading back, I want to say, oh, that's exactly what it is in Genesis. It's just that I wouldn't have got there just reading Genesis.
but perhaps we would if we looked at the Hebrew, and then we also considered that there are other references to a plurality with the Son and the Father and the Spirit all throughout Old Testament Scripture. Within Old Testament Scripture.
I was with you up to that last sentence. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would, if you only ever read the 39 books of the Old Testament, you would not end up with the doctrine of the Trinity. I think you can read the New Testament and then go back and read the Old Testament and say, maybe it's here, but you wouldn't have got there from there, is what I mean to say. Colin, you had to.
Well, one of the things that I, like so many of us have read this over the course of our lives and done the same thing, puzzled over it. But I thought about what could be, back up one, would you, sir? About what you could substitute and still find yourself in agreement with the structure. And if you substituted the word truth for word, or the word son, or the word spirit, those all fit within at least the context of our understanding of the Trinity.
Closest comparison you'd get maybe, because you just had me thinking this, and also Joyce's comment, closest thing you get in the Old Testament to language like this is maybe, working off my memory, Proverbs 8, wisdom was with God at the beginning. It's close, the idea of treating wisdom like a person. But again, no Jewish person reading Proverbs 8 would say, oh, there's a second God named wisdom. No, no. It just means God was really wise. Right? This seems to be saying something even more than that. Right? So here's Ben's best guess at it. This is what I put in the book. Is that it makes sense if you were Greek, because John just hijacked your words and tinkered with them, as preachers are prone to do, by the way. So, like Plato taught that the universe was best understood as reflecting a higher reality, a world of ideas. So Platonic philosophy in 30 seconds. Here we go, ready? Okay. So, that is a chair. But this is also a chair. And what Plato would say is that means that somewhere out there in the invisible world of ideas, is the perfect idea of a chair, so that you can recognize, for some Greek thinkers, that was the real world. That underneath or above the universe, remember, don't have a God necessarily, or maybe we got pagan gods. Like standing up behind the universe is this world of ideas. So what I think John is doing is he's hijacking that word and saying, you're right. There is a big idea behind the universe. Except it's not an idea, right? It's a person. You're right, there is rationality behind the universe. There's a purpose for the universe. There really is something going on here. And I met him. See what he did there? That was strange. You're right, there is such a thing as an idea, and I met him. Well, now, that's cheating, John. It's either an idea or a person. John says, no, I met him. I really met the meaning of the whole universe. He was walking around Galilee one day. Okay? And that's the really crazy claim that he's making. Hebrews, and John's one of them, Jewish people, agree that there was a higher world, but they said, no, it's not about these crazy abstract philosophy stuff. It's a person. That back there behind everything is one person who wants to be known. And you don't get to know that person by reflective philosophy. So, listen, in human history, there has never been anybody better about thinking about stuff than the ancient Greeks. If you could get there by thinking about it, they got there. Can I get like totally off topic for just a second? Anybody here taught that before Christopher Columbus, everybody thought the world was flat? You guys taught that in grade school somewhere? 3 centuries before Jesus, or a century and a half, ancient Greeks were already estimating the circumference of the earth to within 3% accuracy using shadows and geometry at the bottom of a well.
2 wells.
2 wells, yeah, get it 2. Doing analytic geometry to figure out the earth is round. And getting closer than Columbus. Columbus was off by 40%, right? He was an entire continent and an ocean off. Thought he was in India, right? The Greeks were down to 3%. Never left Athens. Just staring at stuff and thinking. I mean, if you could get there by thinking, the Greeks got there. But what the Hebrew people thought differently was, you don't get to that ultimate reality by sitting around thinking. It's through these stories. So when you read the Old Testament, do you get a lot of analytic philosophy? Like reflections on the meaning of life? There's maybe, out of 39 books, what 1 or 2 books in the entire Old Testament just sit around and talk about stuff? Yeah, I mean, you're like, I don't, nothing comes to mind. Ecclesiastes is just kind of a sit around and think about it book. What's the meaning of life? Well, and so 13 or so chapters of, well, okay. Proverbs has a lot of thinking in it, but most of it's practical. This is how you should behave. The Old Testament is not full of books where people just sit around and think about stuff. It's stories about people. Once upon a time, there was a man named Abraham, and he was walking around in Mamre, and he met a guy. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Jacob, and he was at the ford of Jabbok, and he wrestled with an angel. Once upon a time, there was a man named Moses, and he was out in the field, and there was a bush, and it was on fire, but it didn't burn up, and it spoke to him. See the difference there? That it's not stories of people doing philosophy. Philosophy is how you get to understand an idea. Okay? And I'm saying that as a philosopher. I love philosophy. I love to sit around and stare at the ceiling and think about stuff, right? Celine came into my office the other day, and I was staring. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Working." I had an idea. I didn't have it settled. I was trying to work it out in my head, but it looked a lot like I was sitting still. Okay, working real hard. Okay, philosophy's great, but that's not how you get to the meaning of the universe. What the Hebrews believed and what John believed was there's a person back there. How do you meet a person? Okay, I can sit in my room all I want, stare at the ceiling, and I'm not going to know anything more about Colin than I did an hour beforehand. Just by thinking about what is a Colin. if the calling is this, then, you just don't get there, okay? How do you get to know a calling? Well, somebody tells you a story. Well, let me tell you about Colin. We were in a really serious elders meeting, and suddenly out of nowhere, he starts making puns about musical references. Okay? Now you know something about Colin you didn't know before. I don't have one in mind, it's all of them, Colin. If you meet Colin, you've heard music puns, okay? So I told you a story, and now you know something about that person that you didn't know before. And you never would have got there by syllogisms or debating or things like that. That's how you meet people. How do you figure out your spouse or the person who might become your spouse? You sit in your room and say, I'm going to think of the perfect wife. Okay? Don't get very far. Okay? What you do is you go out and you meet somebody. And then she says, no, not you. That's what usually happens. But anyway, right? You meet people and you say, tell me about them. And you hear the universe. But it's a person, not an idea. In the beginning, God did something. And that God is a person. Okay? With me so far? I know we kind of traveled a long, weird road to get there. But in the beginning, a person. That's what Christians believe. Person, not merely an idea. Okay?
So who is he trying to convince?
Yes.
Philosophers or Hebrews who buying into philosophy?
Yeah. To me, and this is my weird reading, it's kind of like listening to a Timothy Keller sermon where it's intellectual enough that if you think you're smart, you go, oh, I got that. So Tim Keller, Presbyterian ministers, preached in Manhattan. Preaching a sermon in Manhattan is different than preaching a sermon at Nazareth. Yeah, okay. Yeah, right? I mean, you got a little different crowd you're talking to, right? And so he'll cite philosophers in his sermon and reference things. And he's not trying to do philosophy, but he's trying to let you know, I know what you're thinking. Let me help you connect from here to there. John uses really simple language. In all fairness, in theory, he's a fisherman, right? He's not supposed to be doing philosophy. But he knows enough terminology that he can say, let me see if I can put it in a way that connects with what you think already. I think. It's, in theory, the last gospel written. So John doesn't need to just tell the story again. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already done that. John is trying to say something bigger that just like shoots over the top of it. And I do wonder, as we say, was he staring at the ceiling? Is he really just really bored on the Isle of Patmos in isolation? He's like, he's doing analytic philosophy. I don't know. That's a good question.
He was Hebrew enough that he's going to begin the story with something they're familiar with.
It's fascinating that it's very clearly a Genesis reference.
Sure. And
And it's very clearly some kind of Greek philosophy reference because there's no logos in Genesis 1. You'd never find that. And so he takes two ideas that in theory have nothing to do with each other, crams them together, says they're both basically true, and I met him.
But
And you go, you mean?
but in the Genesis story, it's the same as here. He pulls it into the idea that they understand the Genesis story as the creation of light and darkness.
Yeah.
And so he personalizes
Yeah.
this person that he's talking about in this story as he was life and he was light.
Yeah.
And the darkness, there was no darkness in him, but the light shone in darkness. So
Yeah.
he's beginning a story about, he's going to talk about somebody that's going to introduce something new in a bigger way than they'd ever known before.
Yeah. And that's the big idea here. So, again, the best I can do with this introduction called the prologue of John, because nobody else knows what to call it, is he's taken, from different schools of philosophical thought and religious thought, He's saying, yeah, you're on the right track. There's a meaning here we need to know. But now I'm going to tell you a story about a person. Okay? Like this would make a great introduction to a philosophy book. Except chapter 1 is, let me tell you about a person I met. And that difference is the main point of emphasis I want to get tonight, in case you haven't noticed. Person. The story is about a person who created all things and meeting that person while he was walking around Galilee.
And when he's talking to Christians, in 1 John, he says, we proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning.
Yeah.
So he's telling another story about the same individual.
Yeah. Yeah, the beginning, first 3 verses of 1 John 1, very similar. In fact, there he has all the sense language words that I listened to him, I saw him, I stared at him, I touched him, you know. And he was a person.
And then Paul does the same thing in Philippian letter
Yeah.
to Christians. About who this person is.
Yeah. So John 1, 14 through 18 is the grand finale then. The Word, because, you know, he apparently thought you knew what he meant. Go figure, right? Whatever he meant, he said it became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's like the home run swing of the introduction. Right? Big idea. Infinite being and personhood behind the creation of the universe and light and life and everything you know. And then he was walking around one day. Right? Where was he? He was down here. There is nothing like this in any ancient thought. On occasion, in the Hebrew Scriptures, somebody might pop in who was kind of an angel or a divine being of some kind. But then they pop back out. Like they didn't stay. They had dinner and they left. Right? You didn't see them live out an entire human life. If you're an ancient Roman, you know, Zeus might dress up like a human to go seduce a woman if he liked, but he didn't stick around. Okay. What John is claiming is, oh no, he stuck around. Well, you mean like for a couple of days? Oh, it was 3.5 years I knew him. And in fact, other guys say he's longer than that. So, he was here quite a long time. And we saw his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, was he a person or was he the glory of God? John says, yep. Go ahead, ask him which one it is. He says, yes. That great, big, indescribable, no word can capture it, meaning of the universe. Yep. And it was this person right here, and I met him. And then at the end, same point. No one has ever seen God. Remember that hiddenness bit we talked about? John says, you're right. Never have seen him, have you? Well, I did once. The only God is the Father's side. He made him known. I met him.
But then he also includes the story that God makes himself known by other individuals.
Yeah.
When he says he sent a man named
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, so there's been glimpses before, but here is the whole story. Here is everything you need to know. That if you could do what John did, which was meet Jesus, and really get to know him, you would know all you needed to know about God by meeting and knowing that person. That is, in my mind, again, the most basic ground level claim of Christian faith. There is a God, he's responsible for everything, and he is this man, and you could actually know him like you know other people. That I know my children, I know my wife, I know my neighbors, that you could meet God something like that and know him to that depth of intimacy. Because he's not an idea. He is a person. And in fact, on that day, he was a human person. He was walking around. You can meet him. So what does John do? For the next several chapters and verses, he tells you stories about people who met Jesus.
I just want to bring up this one verse.
Yep.
In 11, he came to his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. You know, there's something holy about that to me,
Mm-hmm.
because we're not an accident.
Yeah.
We are not born of blood or flesh. We were born by the will of God, and we're going to try to get to know Him. And
Yeah.
that is majestic, and I mean that is powerful to me.
Yeah. That by way of God doing something, you could know Him like family.
Mhm.
But that again, as you say, it wouldn't be accidental. Like the next one I was going to go to, you weren't like traveling on the mountaintop and you had this spiritual ecstasy and I happened to accidentally stumble into God. But you would know Him like family. That you would know Him because God called you a child. That you could know Him that closely and permanently. Yeah, if you ever like stumbled onto a spot where a light came down and you met God, you mark it on your map, right? I want to go back. That's what ancient people did. That's where they built their temple. We got good reception there on our telephone. We put a marker there. We go back. That's where we met God. And what John is saying is, no, I walked around with Him. He wasn't at that spot. He was wherever Jesus was. And everybody that met Him came to that same conclusion. So what was Sunday's sermon about? Philip says to us, Nathaniel, you got to come meet this guy. And Nathaniel does. And he says, oh. And every story in John kind of builds that way. Somebody comes to him and says, I don't know. And then they meet him, and then they say, oh. And that's John's point. There is a person you can meet, you can know. And that person is the ground of our knowledge, of our relationships, of our right and wrong, of our sense of the universe. Everything we got built on a person, not an idea. So, big point, in case I haven't repeated it enough times. The ultimate witness to God is God Himself as a man. And the ultimate witness to that man is this story, which John has now begun to tell us about his friend, Jesus of Nazareth. Let me tell you about it, is what John's going to do from here. Okay? So, discussion questions for 5 or 10 minutes before I turn you loose. You ever think about this? Why don't you say, I think my neighbor is God on earth? No, it's a silly question. Just stick with me a second. What would it take for you to be convinced that someone you had met was God on earth? Or put another way, think of a person you know, the best person you know. Now give me all the reasons you're pretty sure that person is not God on earth.
Well, the first time you detect a flaw.
Yeah, like even when they're really great, they have flaws. Seem to be pretty limited. Seem to be pretty human in all the bad ways, even if they're really good. So my first point is, don't underestimate how big a deal it is that John says, no, He's God. This isn't something people walk around saying about everybody. Well, bugger off, He's just God on earth. Judy has never said that. And we don't say that about people that we know. In fact, the more we meet them, the more you get to know people, the more flaws you know.
Many times we think in terms of human love, and of course the three characters love it. The way God loves is different to the way people love.
Mm-hmm.
People love is based on performance. You make a mistake, it decreases in value.
Mm-hmm.
So, God's love is different to that.
Okay.
So you have to start with that story about who's the story about, and then how do you contact a person you know with that story? How do you engage them into that story? How do you make them feel that they can be a part of that story?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess, my point being that John's is kind of the opposite of what we usually think when we meet people. Have you ever read a biography of somebody you admired and then wish you hadn't? My brother was, older brother, huge Roy Orbison fan. Loved Roy Orbison music. Not even the right era for my brother, but he was retro before retro was cool. He loved Roy Orbison. And then he read a Roy Orbison biography. He's just like everybody else. He's kind of a lousy guy. Turns out, sports idols, presidents, you pick. The more you know about them, the less impressed you are. John's claim is the opposite. The more you know about Jesus, the more you're going to be convinced. That's a crazy claim to make about a person. You'd better be sure. And John apparently is. So that was my first question I thought was worth asking. What's weird about this claim? You just don't make it very often. There's a reason we don't say it. That's God on earth. A lot to live up to. In fact, my running gag is when somebody says they've heard of me, somebody says, "Oh, yeah, you're the preacher at Central. I've heard people talk about you." My immediate response is, well, they're all liars. Because I just assume the more you know about me, the less you think. Right? They're liars down there. Don't listen to them. Okay. Why do you suppose it matters that John wants to tell us about God as a person and not merely an abstract idea? I've been beating on that point for 50 minutes. Why does it matter? What's wrong with an idea? Ideas are pretty good. I've had a couple.
It's not something you do.
Okay, an idea isn't something you do.
If my purpose is to honor God by the way I live, I have to know what he does.
Yeah. So, ideas are kind of inert, stationary. 2 + 2 = 4. It's like it's a fantastic idea. Whoever wrote that down the first time, that was great. That was a really good one. I ought to keep that. Now, do something with it.
The person
Yeah.
is something you can know, either know personally or know from the witness.
Okay.
And that's what First John's always talks about. That, as you quoted earlier, we were with him, we saw him, we touched him. He was a real person.
So, people have greater depth than just an idea. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, got it. What's next? Right? But Naomi. Now, if I told you one thing about Naomi, would I be done? What if I talked for an hour about Naomi? Would I be done? Would I have said everything there could possibly be said? Do you know her? Like there's depth there. You can just keep on going with the person. You never get to the bottom. And again, that's what's being claimed about God.
And the story that John writes here ends with that same idea that we knew a lot about him and we
Could've
saw
said
a
more.
lot of things.
Yep.
That if we wrote about him, they'd feel.
We'd never stop.
Never
Yeah,
stop.
he's a person. Joy?
If you go back to the first verse, in the beginning is when God walked with man in the garden.
Okay.
And so now you have the ability to again walk with God and have a relationship.
There's the magic word. Very good. So the magic word I was going for with this question, I always have a reason to ask a question, is relationship. Right? I can have a relationship with a person. Kind of hard to have a relationship with an idea. Okay, 2 + 2 = 4. I don't deny it. I'm not in love with it. Even the word good. Well, good. I like it, but I don't get to know good unless good was a person, which, by the way, is also what John claims. Good is a person. I met him. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So a person you can develop a relationship with. And that's, again, fundamental what Christianity is claiming. Speaking of Keller again, Keller likes to say that Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. I would say it's probably a religion and a relationship, but whatever. It's definitely a relationship. That it's 2 people meeting. You got to have that, or else you haven't got it. Did you get your hand up?
Well, it was just a kind of academic, interesting. It's interesting that in our culture that there is there's a moment where relationship and abstract coexist, and you alluded to it earlier. If you actually, I read memoir of Phil Collins, who was a drummer and singer for Genesis. I really like Genesis stuff. A lot of artists, people identify with them and have sort of a relationship that's in the abstract because of the product of their art. They even have, Genesis actually has a song about that, about having a relationship with someone you see on television. But then you read the memoir and you go, okay, this is who Phil Collins is as a person, separate from his art, and you go,
Oh, yeah, maybe I wouldn't invite him over for dinner. Right, yeah. No, there's a very big difference between a personal relationship and interacting even with a really well-expressed idea, a piece of music or a piece of art. You see a Picasso, you know something about Picasso, but you don't have a relationship with Picasso. You don't know him. Okay, there is a difference. So it has to do with relationship, it has to do with what Judy said earlier about action, right? People do things. So what is God doing? What am I supposed to do? How do those things connect? Those are all questions you can ask when we get to the people level, not at the idea level. I think a lot of folks would be happier with Christianity at the idea level. Then you can just say, do I believe it's true or not? And then go on about my day. But if it's personal level, do something now. Donnie, go for it.
I feel like it's important to realize that to relate, like the word relationship, the common word you'll find is the word ship. We worship God, but we cannot really relate to God in heaven the way we can relate to God in earth. So we can relationship with Him. We can clearly worship God, but we relate to Him through His Son, Jesus.
So good point. I mean, again, what is different even between the Hebrew conception of God and the Hebrew Scriptures versus what John is claiming? Most of the Old Testament is reminding you that you can't have a normal relationship with God. My thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. We are not the same, you and I, right? Leviticus, what is Leviticus about? Isn't it a weird book? Leviticus is a book about you can have a relationship with God, but it's going to be weird. Like here's some weird rules. Here's how you cut your hair. Here's how you put your fabric together. Why? Because that's the way you're going to have a relationship with God. It's not like meeting your next door neighbor. He's going to have rules, and you're just going to go with it because, right? You can't have a next door neighbor relationship with the God of the Old Testament. You just burn up, right? And then John says, and that's absolutely true. And then I met him. And throw everything out. Okay, now wait a second. What do you mean you met him? You can't meet him. That's not allowed. John says, yeah, I know. That's why it was really cool that I met him. No one has seen God at any time, except I did. And so that's the story of John. Okay, completely out of time. Thanks for your attention. Next week, chapter 2, we'll talk about who this person is that John wants to tell us about.